and welcome to the Business of Data podcast. I'm your host, Catherine King, and it's a pleasure to have you join us today. In this series, we'll be speaking to senior data analytics leaders to share their experiences, challenges, and insights. Let's go ahead and dive straight into today's episode. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Business of Data podcast. This week we're talking all about data ops and future thinking. And joining me today is Harvinder Atwal, who is the Group Data Director for MoneySuperMarket Group. Now, just a bit about Harvinder before we dive into our discussion. As I say, he's the group's data director, and he leads a team of 75 data professionals and is responsible for creating value from data to deliver the group's strategy across all its brands. Before joining MoneySuperMarket, Harvinder held data and analytics roles at British Airways, Lloyds, and Dunnhumby. And also, Harvinder is also an author and recently published the Practical Data Ops Delivering Agile Data Science at Scale book in the end of 2019. Harvinder, welcome. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. Good to be here.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us. As we do with every episode on the Bod Pod, I always start with a bit of a nosy question. And my question for you is all about this book. What inspired you to author a book about data ops?
So I guess I've been a data analytics professional for a very long time. My entire career I've been working with data and algorithms. So there's been a lot of change over the last 25 years in terms of the amount of data you have access to, the technologies that you use. And one of the things that probably hasn't kept up is being able to create value from data. So we have this massive explosion in, big data, data science, AI, and so on. But actually, when you dig beneath the surface and you look at the value that's being created, it's nowhere near at the level that you would kind of expect to see. So, there are various surveys out there. New Vantage Partners do one every year, and they found that only 7.3% of organizations say their data and analytics is excellent. So there's actually kind of almost like a fundamental problem in this space. Now, there shouldn't be, because data has the ability to make radical transformations in people's lives, right? So improving healthcare, reducing fraud and crime, helping customers save time and money. There's no end of applications. So I kind of got thinking, why is this the case, right? So why, if there's so much interest in data, we have so much data, we have this technology, why are we not creating value for it? Yeah. So hence that was kind of the driver for writing the book, because we had kind of gone down a bit of a journey in MoneySuperMarket where, we had pivoted away from being a sort of traditional sort of insight led organization to wanting to do things differently. So we're a technology led organization, or we have a very large technology function. We realized there was quite a lot we could borrow from our colleagues in technology and apply to data. We didn't realize it at the time, but that was data ops. So I kind of wanted to share some of that journey, some of that thinking with the wide community out there, and help them kind of understand how they could overcome some of these challenges of creating value from data. So that was the driver. I'm quite passionate about data. The last thing I want to see is data science have an AI winter moment where there's so much hype and then people are disappointed, and then there's a lack of investment, because I think generally data has so much to contribute to human welfare.
Absolutely. And I mean, you've touched on it there just in that bit of an intro about the fact that data ops perhaps isn't not necessarily widely understood. I think that's unfair, but it's perhaps not top of everyone's to-do list. So let's set the scene. What does data ops mean to you in kind of a definition term, I suppose?
Yeah, so I share a definition with Data Kitchen. So Data Kitchen are kind of like one of the lead space, and they're massive advocates for data ops. And for us, data ops is a combination of data analytics, so in its broadest sense of including data science and AI, combined with lean thinking. So lean thinking, there's kind of like two flavors. One is the original lean thinking, which comes from Toyota's manufacturing system. So Toyota described that as a system for the absolute limit. So it's really about looking at your processes and seeing how you can make them more efficient and drive up quality. The other two methodologies or areas where DataOps borrows from are from software development, so Agile. So the ability to be adaptable to change, making sure that you're continually satisfying the customer. And then the final one is DevOps. So DevOps, for people who aren't familiar with it, arose because of this conflict between developers on one side who wanted to make a lot of changes, add lots of features, develop new products, and operations people on the other side who had to make sure that these data products ran in production reliably. Now, the challenge was that you get to a place where the operations people are maintaining a really brittle product in production because there have been so many changes over the years and months that any sort of small change can have unintended consequences and break things. So DevOps was there to make sure that these things didn't happen, that you can make rapid, small iterative changes in your software product without breaking things.
Fantastic. Now, I kind of signposted towards it when I asked the question, but do you think that's what everyone means when they talk about data ops? Because there does seem to be a bit of a disparity in how people describe it.
You know, absolutely. So I guess like a lot of terms in the data space, it's not necessarily well defined. I mean, there are a dozen definitions of data science, for example, but really there are there's one other sort of competing version of DataOps or definition, if you like, which is DevOps for data. So that's applying DevOps principles to data pipelines. I think that's just too narrow a definition. I mean, your data pipeline is not your end product. With DataOps in its more wider sense, what you're thinking about is your outcomes and your impacts, and then working back from that to make sure that you have all the people, process, and technology and data to deliver that. There's one final way of defining DataOps, which is more vendor-led, which is a vendor will say, I've got this product, let's badge it as DataOps, and DataOps is whatever my product does, but I don't think that's helpful.
Fantastic. So I know you kind of started out this just in your answer there, but the general maturity of DataOps is somewhat, limited in compared to other areas. Are there any particular companies that you think are doing it really well, or perhaps even industries?
I guess some of the more mature sort of Silicon Valley firms are deploying a lot of the DataOps practices, whether they call it DataOps or something else. But I think we're probably maybe like 5 years behind technology in terms of their adoption of DevOps. So definitely a niche but growing area, but I expect a lot of the practices of DataOps to be adopted quite rapidly over the next few years, particularly with the migration to the cloud and companies needing to be more agile and go through digital transformation. So yeah, it's small, but I expect it to grow quite rapidly over the next few years.
Brilliant. Now, my last question for you in terms of setting the scene for our discussion is, I watched your presentation in the DNA Live conference that we recently had. It was fantastic. Now, you said that the organizations need to change their mindsets as well as business processes. And that means thinking of data as a product, which I thought was really, really interesting. So product rather than project is kind of what you were saying there. But how should data leaders promote this kind of thinking organization-wide? How does that actually happen?
Yeah, so the best way of making it happen is really to work with stakeholders and understand outcomes. So traditionally, the way people have approached using data is think about actionable insight. So what can we find in the data that will produce some insight and create a recommendation for stakeholders in the organization to do something differently. So it might be do A rather than B. But actually we're now well beyond that in terms of capability. So both with the amount of data and the technology we have to thinking of creating data products that drive an outcome. So give you a really simplistic example. We used to have conversations with our marketing department a few years ago around how we would use data to help improve marketing campaigns, and they might come up with, oh, we know a customer's date of birth, so let's send them a happy birthday email, for example. But actually, you need to work with your stakeholders and say, right, but what outcome are you actually trying to drive? Your outcome is not to say happy birthday to the customer. It's actually to get them back to our website and to click out on a product and hopefully save money, which is our mission. So if that's the outcome, then it's, well, what data product can we build that helps deliver that outcome? So in this case, it might be a recommendation model. And therefore, what data do we need in order to create that recommendation model? So it's about flipping everything on its head and saying, well, we're not going to start with the data and try and find some magic nugget of insight. We'll take the outcome and then we'll say, well, what kind of data product can we build that will deliver that outcome?
Fantastic.
So yeah, I mean, that's the way to kind of approach it internally within the organization.
Yeah. Absolutely. I love that idea of breaking it down and kind of almost going to the end in order to start at the beginning. So let's have a chat about overcoming the barriers to adoption. We've spoken about it for the last, five minutes or so, that, it's struggling to kind of get off the ground in every business and organization. And I think 2020 is really the year of making sure value is communicated, whether we're talking about the pandemic or the recession. Companies are being hit hard right now. So why do you think many organizations are yet to adopt this agile way of thinking and doing? What are the kind of key barriers that you can identify for us?
So, I mean, there are a number of them. So one is, might just be old-fashioned thinking around access to technology and tools. So if you imagine a few years ago, a lot of companies would have locked down access to data because it sat in operational systems, so systems of engagement. And therefore, actually, it was kind of dangerous to allow people to have access to that because, one, they might break things, but also there might be personal data in there and so on. So things were quite heavily controlled. That's no longer the case. There are ways of allowing people access to data without the risk of breaking things or without the risk of seeing personal data. So there's that kind of legacy mindset of control that still exists in some organizations. The other is just lack of knowledge of best practice as well. So in a lot of organizations, you may have sort of data people brought on who are relatively junior, who, data science or coding, it just means to an end. They don't really understand the wider best practice around software development that needs to be applied to data and so on. And the other is just, there are some organizational barriers when it comes to data and data-centric thinking. So, for example, I say to people, you would never have your front-end developers report into a different part of the organization from, your back-end server-side developers, and then have your data architects report into commercial and your DBAs report into marketing. That will never happen. You'd have one integrated technology function in the organization where everyone sat together. But for some reason, people think it's perfectly acceptable for data scientists to sit in a different part of the organization from the data engineers, from the architects, and so on. So, a lot of organizations haven't got around to thinking of being, data lifecycle centric, to say, well, no, actually, the data only takes one journey, right? So it makes sense for one function to own that end to end, which can be a significant barrier.
Absolutely, brilliant. And I think it's fair to say from what you've just explained there that a lot of thinking has to go into this. It's not going to be something that just happens or one person leads it and therefore it kind of, I'm thinking of, say, data literacy. If you have one executive who's really key at driving that, eventually data literacy will become kind of on the to-do list. Whereas with DataOps, it seems that because it's so multifaceted in the barriers that exist, actually it's going to take an organization to say, right, this is a priority now, and then kind of move through those barriers. But I think what I want to have a chat with you about now, Harvinder, is that it can be done. And I've had the privilege of talking to lots of different executives on these Bod Pod episodes. And something I've heard due to COVID is what was taking me 3 years has now taken me 3 months, and kind of a condensed in time.
Yeah.
Now, what your team was able to do was replace processes which used to take, I think it was 11 hours, wasn't it? And it now just takes 5 minutes. So can you please just run through, use that as a kind of a user case for that type of thinking and the way that you managed to achieve that?
Yeah, so I'm referring to some of the sort of marketing ML models that we have that drive some of our marketing. So previously we used to have quite long sort of data cycles and development cycles around our models. So we kind of looked at that end to end and said, kind of like, where are the bottlenecks? Good thing is we were kind of re-platforming at the time, so we were moving to Google Cloud Platform, which kind of made things easier in terms of us being able to look at everything afresh and say, right, okay, how do we approach this in a completely different way, which allows us to, one, be able to develop models much more quickly, and also reduce sort of latency in our model scoring. So one of the things that we did was, we broke up the entire sort of model scoring pipeline into lots of different steps, and the model training pipeline into lots of different steps, and then introduce automation and reproducibility in there. And then what reproducibility allows you to do is to be able to test things in a development environment. And then if you pass or test, then you deploy that in your production environment, and that's can lead to quite a high level of automation. So that's one massive benefit. You can also work on different parts of the pipeline in parallel. So rather than working on one giant code base, you're essentially splitting it up and able to make changes in just one place without having to affect others. It allowed us to parallelize our work as well. So each of those jobs can be run in its own container, and you can run that on Kubernetes in parallel. So there are a lot of changes we kind of made simultaneously, or rather, in a short period of time to be able to kind of create those efficiencies and actually create a far more robust process.
Fantastic. And then, so thinking in that same way and harking back to your presentation that you did, one thing that was really interesting to me was that you said that the days of having one huge data and analytics solution are gone, and that companies really should have multiple technologies. How do you then manage and coordinate and this to define efficient workflows for your team members? So kind of thinking of kind of chopping up the processes, how do you manage that?
Yeah, so we make sure that whatever new tool we're going to actually deploy fits within our ecosystem. So it's not just a case of going with something that may actually be really good, but actually it's not going to fit with our sort of end-to-end processes for developing a data pipeline or maintaining a data pipeline. So so it's not necessarily a technology zoo, if you like. So it is a kind of like controlled process. So one of the things that we kind of start with is we have like a technology radar, which is something we borrow from ThoughtWorks, whereby we kind of evaluate all the technology out there. We kind of only need to be sort of 6 months or so. Point where we say, are there any sort of new technologies that we should be looking at? Doing concept spiking, maybe chatting to vendors or peers out there around what they think of it. Equally important is to say, well, yeah, there may be some technology, maybe some hype around it, but actually it's not a good fit, so we need to just like park that and exclude it. Then, when we are evaluating a new piece of technology, then really it is a case of, testing out first. So, doing technology spikes, doing a proof of value, a proof of concept, before we actually adopt it. But that interoperability is still really important. So, with all the technology out there, it's important that it actually does fit together, as well as being functionally valuable in its own right.
Fantastic. Now,
which is a challenge because,
Oh, sorry, I was going to jump in and ask for a piece of advice, really, because I was hosting one of our virtual roundtables recently, and this topic came up about, constantly looking for new solutions and technologies to kind of all fit together, as opposed to having one mass solution. And one of the executives in that event raised the issue of feeling nervous that as soon as you say, right, this is the one for me, 6 months down the line, there's going to be something better that can do what you want it to do better. And now you're stuck with this particular solution for however long. So how do you do that analysis where you've chosen your solution, you've run the test and you think, yep, this is going to work? How do you then deal with that fear that actually in 6 months' time there could be something better out there?
Well, it's really simple. You just have to accept that, right? So the technology is changing, and it's about, well, at this point in time, what is the best piece of technology? So yeah, you do have to take into account things like exit costs. So you don't want to be necessarily wedded to a technology that is difficult to extract from.
Mm-hmm.
But then it comes into this sort of build versus buy. Do you buy a proprietary solution, or these days there's a lot of managed open source, which is kind of like our kind of preference, if you like. So there's all these trade-offs you have to make. There's no sort of perfect technology out there, and it kind of very much depends on your use case and your organization's appetite to change and risk as well. But then sometimes you just have to, live with the technology you have, right? So, we have components in our stack where we're like, well, actually there are better things, but the cost of change is so high relative to the benefit it brings. You're just like, well, you might as well just stick with what you have. Particularly when it comes to things like, databases and ETL tools, can be very significant change to migrate to something else. But, what's the actual benefit? You're still using the same data.
Yeah. Fantastic. And I suppose that links nicely into that value discussion as well. It is a case of weighing up the value and then the cost that it's going to inevitably bring as well.
Mm-hmm.
So moving our conversation forward, now you mentioned culture being a big impact. Now for you personally, you've gone through a bit of a transformation recently. You were recently reporting to the CEO. Now you're reporting to the Chief Customer Officer. This could change again. How have you personally managed the buy-in from executives, especially when your direct reporting has changed along the way? And how would you give advice in terms of securing buy-in from an executive team to adopt DataOps principles?
Yeah, so the first thing is that, we are very much aligned on objectives with our stakeholders. So, we have OKRs as an organization, so objectives and key results that we're trying to deliver to. So the first thing is to be really aligned on those objectives with your stakeholders, so that, what you're proposing and what you're recommending is actually going to help them. Mutual relationship. So, you're helping deliver their roadmap while at the same time using data to inform it. So that's the first part. So we, try and build up quite strong stakeholder relationships where we're trying to drive for the same results. In terms of getting adoption for DataOps, I mean, we didn't really need permission for DataOps. All we needed from senior execs was firstly a recognition that the entire data lifecycle should be managed by one function. So, rewind a few years, data engineering and, some of the data platforms were owned by the technology function. The product analytics were, sat within product and commercial. So that was one major change, was bringing everyone together who works on data lifecycle within one function, which had quite significant benefits. The other was a recognition that actually we needed to own and maintain our own data analytics platform. So historically we had been dependent on what the technology function gave us to work with, but now we have our own entire cloud platform, if you like, Google Cloud Platform with analytics, which is managed by data separately from most of our technology platform and AWS. So it's getting the buy-in on those two things, which was actually the biggest enablers really of this journey.
Fantastic. And you say that maintaining that kind of really strong connection and communication was key for you. And instantly what I want to ask you is, how was that during the COVID era? And I mean, kind of looking back when we were in lockdown and things were, you were out of the office. Now things are kind of easing up and we're in that very strange zone. So how has communication been maintained? Has there been any disconnect? How have you managed that?
So remote working has actually gone really well. We kind of, being a digital first company, we're pretty much set up from day one. I mean, I think there were very few sort of snags from the company going 100% remote working. So not much friction in terms of our ability to do our job. Everyone is still able to function. We obviously substitute face-to-face meetings with VC, like most organizations. Things have maybe become a little bit more transactional due to the fact that we're remote working, fewer sort of water cooler moments. Creative tasks are probably a lot harder. So, I miss physical offsites. It's much harder to do that over VC. But apart from that, surprisingly well. We'll be drifting back into the office slowly. So, it's all voluntary, but right. I expect more people to be, in the office starting with 1 day a week.
Fantastic. Now, my kind of final question around the culture of this topic is, you've clearly done a lot to establish where you are today. So what are the main things you look for when you're hiring talent to fit this data-driven culture that you have curated?
Yeah, so we have a set of values within data. So they're collaboration, continuous improvement, and cross-functional working. So they are the kind of values we're expecting people to display. So collaboration, not just within data, but also we think we sit between data producers. So we're very reliant on our technology department for the data that gets captured that we use, and data consumers at the other end. So they're our commercial, marketing, and finance, and all the other areas of the organization. So collaboration with those areas as well. Cross-functional working is also really important. So being able to work with teams who have different skills from yourself, who have different stakeholders. And then the continuous improvement mindset is really important, that, we're looking for people who aren't just satisfied with, how things work. They're actually looking at the way they work and looking to see how they can make improvements to that. So they're the kind of things that we kind of look for in people, on top of the technical skills that they have.
So you're not just looking for agile workers, but agile people as well, constantly analyzing how they're working. That's fantastic. So
yeah,
my last few questions for you, Harvinder, is what's up next? What is coming up for you guys in the next, say, 12 months? Are there any innovation projects that you're excited to be getting underway with?
Yeah, we're actually going through our sort of strategy planning process for next year. And there's so the thing is, you're never done, right? So the difference between a product and a project is that the project has a defined end date, right? A product doesn't. You're constantly looking to improve it, and it's the same with the way that we function. We're constantly trying to improve what we do. So there's lots of areas we've identified where we want to do better. So everything from like test data management, delivering more automation in our processes, and so on. So there's quite a long list. We improve self-service analytics for the rest of the organization and so on. So just a few examples of quite a long list that we're looking at. And obviously we have to go through prioritization, because there's never enough time, never enough people. So it's what you don't do is as important as what you do, to be honest.
Absolutely. And I love the ambitious nature of it as well. So then my last question for you, because I can see the clock has been ticking away here, is if there's one key message you really want our audience to take away from this conversation when it comes to data ops and future thinking, what would that message be?
Yeah, so for me, the creation of data products is key. So moving from the order of using data to drive insight to, if you think about where the value is created for, leading organizations. Think Google, most of their revenue, 9% plus, is really ultimately derives from one single data product, which is their search engine algorithm. Think of Amazon, they generate a lot of value from, the algorithms around recommendation, the algorithms around pricing, and what products to actually stock. So for me, it's about switching data product outcome and impact driven. And if you want to start on the DataOps journey, it's about finding a thin slice of one of those problems to try and solve, and applying some of the best practice around applying DevOps, being agile. There's complexity in data, so building in that automation and monitoring into your data pipelines, deriving success from the iteration of that, and then trying to expand that into other areas once you've demonstrated that you can create value and have sort of reproducible, repeatable processes.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for giving me half an hour of your time today. It's been wonderful chatting with you.
You're welcome.
And I hope to catch up with you very soon.
Great, thank you for the opportunity. Hope the audience finds it helpful.
What a brilliant discussion. I really enjoyed that one, and I think the main thing I'm going to take away from this conversation is the positive nature that Harvinder brings to this topic, and the fact that data ops can be achieved is practical. And although many organizations seem to be wrestling and struggling right now, there is definitely a path for success. As always, make sure you're subscribed to the Business of Data platform, as well as following us on socials, so that you're first in line for our thought-leading content and insights. Until next time, stay well, and I'll see you real soon.